They never heard you because they never listened. They mistook your silence for weakness. They thought that if you weren't the loudest in the room, then you had nothing to say. That if you didn't fight for attention, then you didn't matter. So they talked over you, dismissed you, laughed at you. And every time you opened your mouth, only to be ignored, a piece of you withdrew further into the shadows. You were the one who sat at the edges of conversations, the one whose ideas were stolen before they could ever be acknowledged as yours, the one whose words were cut short by someone more aggressive, more commanding, someone the world deemed more worthy of being heard. You tried to interject, but they steamrolled right past you. You tried to explain, but they dismissed you with a nod, their eyes already shifting toward someone else. They never really saw you, never really heard you, because they never cared to. You learned the cruel lesson early. The world does not make space for the quiet. It does not wait for you to find your voice. It rewards the loud, the bold, the ones who demand attention without hesitation. And because you were different, they made you feel like you were less. Society is built on noise, on voices that never stop, on people who push their way to the front without a second thought. The world glorifies those who speak, but it forgets those who observe. And so they wrote you off. They thought you were weak. They thought you had nothing to offer. They assumed your silence meant you lacked strength, that your quietness was submission. They never once considered that you were listening, watching, waiting. You heard every insult, every careless remark they thought you wouldn't notice. You felt the sting of being the afterthought, the one they never consulted, the one they underestimated. They laughed at your restraint, mocked your quiet presence. They said you were invisible. They treated you like you were insignificant, and you let them. Not because you agreed, but because you knew something they didn't. Your silence was never weakness. It was a storm gathering strength, but they never saw it. All they saw was the quiet, the stillness. They thought they had figured you out. They labeled you shy, timid, forgettable. They spoke for you, made decisions in your absence, acted as if your presence was inconsequential. They pushed you aside like background noise, assuming you had accepted your place in their world. You can still remember the moments when the injustice of it all burned through your chest, the times when your words died in your throat because you knew no one would care to listen, the times when you had something powerful to say, but their voices drowned you out. And maybe, for a while, you believed them. Maybe there were nights when you sat alone, replaying their words, wondering if they were right. Maybe you started to think that your silence really did make you weak, that maybe you weren't built for this world of noise and dominance. But deep inside, something was changed. They thought they were breaking you, but they were only making you stronger. They thought they were keeping you in the shadow, but they were only giving you time to sharpen your edge. They thought you were nothing, but soon they will hear your victory. Beneath the stillness, something stirred. They saw only the surface, the quiet, the restraint, the unshaken calm, but they never looked deeper. They never noticed the fire buried beneath the silence, the heat simmering just below the skin. A volcano appears dormant until the moment it erupts. And you were no different. For a long time, you doubted yourself. Their words took root, tangled in your mind like creeping vines. Maybe they were right. Maybe you were weak. Maybe your voice wasn't meant to be heard. You told yourself that if you had something worth saying, you would have already spoken. That if you were strong, you wouldn't hesitate. Every time you held your tongue, every time you let someone else speak over you, it felt like proof that you were nothing. There were moments, small sparks, where you almost broke free, when the words pressed against your lips, ready to shatter the silence, when the weight of your unspoken thoughts became unbearable. You clenched your fists beneath the table. You swallowed the fire. You forced yourself to shrink back into the quiet. And when the moment passed, you hated yourself for it. You remember the first time your silence cost you something valuable, a childhood memory, sharp and unrelenting, carved into your soul like stone. Maybe it was the time you wanted to stand up for yourself, but fear held you back. Maybe it was the moment someone took credit for your idea, and you let them, because correcting them felt too terrifying. Maybe it was when they called you weak to your face and you let the words settle in your bones, not because they were true, but because you didn't know how to fight back. That memory haunted you. It was proof of everything you weren't. It whispered that you would always be this way, always in the background, always unheard. But somewhere along the way, something changed. One day the doubt didn't settle as deeply. One day the fear didn't grip you as tightly. You started to realize that silence was not the absence of power. It was the preservation of it. You weren't shrinking. You were watching, learning, growing. They thought your quiet meant you were nothing. But the fire beneath the quiet was rising. They never saw it happening. While they filled the air with empty noise, while they drowned in their own voices, you were growing, not in the way they expected, not in loud proclamations or desperate attempts to be noticed. No, your growth was different, like roots digging deep into the earth, unseen, strengthening long before the first leaves break through the soil. While they spoke, you listened. While they boasted, you observed. While they laughed at your silence, you studied their every move, every insult, every dismissal, every moment they overlooked you. It all became fuel. You weren't standing still. You weren't stagnant. You were training in the shadows, sharpening your mind, refining your skill. They mistook your patience for passivity, your stillness for submission, but they failed to realize that true power is not always loud. Some battles are won before they ever begin, forged in quiet preparation. A warrior does not swing blindly. A master does not reveal their craft until the moment is right. And you were becoming the quiet warrior, the one they never saw coming. They thought they knew you, thought they had you figured out. But what they didn't know, what they could never have imagined, was that your silence was never surrender. It was strategy. Every injustice, every moment of being ignored, every time they pushed you aside, it did not break you. It did not weaken you. It built something unshakable inside you, a force they were too blind to notice. They thought the quiet meant nothing, but they were wrong, because soon the world would hear you, and when they did, they would never forget. There comes a moment when silence is no longer an option, a moment when the weight of all the times you were ignored, dismissed, and cast aside becomes unbearable. You held it in for so long, convinced that patience was the answer, that your time would come. But then they took too much. Maybe it was an opportunity stolen right from under you, given to someone louder, someone less capable, but more visible. Maybe it was the moment they spoke over you one too many times, turning your ideas into their victories. Maybe it was the betrayal, the one you never saw coming, the one that cost you something so precious, so irreplaceable, that you could no longer afford to stay quiet. It was the last straw, the breaking point. The world expects the quiet ones to endure, to absorb the pain, to turn the other cheek. They never consider what happens when the silence breaks, when the one they dismissed decides they've had enough. You felt it deep in your chest, the shift, the rising storm, the awakening. The lion that had been resting opened its eyes. The storm that had been calm began to rage. The warrior that had been waiting reached for their weapon. This was your moment of decision, the moment where the road split in two. Stay silent, stay overlooked, stay in the shadows, let them win, or step forward, speak, make them hear you, make them regret ever doubting you. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. You would no longer be what they defined you as. They thought you were too quiet. Now they were about to hear you roar. It wasn't planned, it wasn't rehearsed, but when the moment came, you didn't hesitate. Your first stand, sharp, unshaken, undeniable. The words left your lips like a thunderclap in a silent room. It wasn't just speech, it was declaration. a force that cut through the noise, a fire that refused to be smothered, and the world froze. They didn't know what to do with you. You, the quiet one. You who had spent a lifetime in the background, suddenly standing in the center. They laughed, at first, thinking it was a fluke, a momentary spark that would flicker and die. They pushed back, tried to shove you back into the silence they were comfortable with, but you didn't move. The battle had begun, and battle it was. Doubt creeping in, fear clawing at the edges of your resolve. Every step forward was met with resistance, with voices that told you to sit back down, to stay in your place. But you had already tasted it, the feeling of being heard, the undeniable rush of power that came with standing tall. Then came the first victory, small but undeniable. Maybe it was a single moment, one person who finally listened, a room that went silent to hear what you had to say, an outcome that shifted because you refused to back down. And just like that, the energy changed. For the first time, you felt it, the impact of your voice. The silence they had trapped you in was gone, and now they couldn't unhear you. One battle does not make a warrior. One moment of courage does not erase a lifetime of silence. You knew this. You knew the fight wasn't over, because the world does not give power freely. Just as you found your voice, they fought back. Some with laughter, some with doubt, some with outright resistance. Friends who preferred the quieter version of you. Family who told you to stay humble, to stop making waves. Society whispering that you were better off in the shadows where they had placed you. And then there was Gachum, you, the voice inside, the one that had been trained in doubt for so long. What if they're right? What if your voice is just noise? What if this fight was never meant to be yours? The war had begun, not just against them, but against every fear you had ever swallowed. You could feel the weight of it, the pull to retreat, to slip back into silence. It would be easier, wouldn't it, to let them win, to shrink back into the space they made for you, to pretend none of this ever happened, but something inside you had changed. The fire was too strong, the taste of power too real, the echo of your own voice too unforgettable. This was the moment, the Ipa's defining moment, to give in or to push forward, to fall back into the quiet life they assigned you, or to fight for the life you were meant to live. And you knew. You could never be silent again, not now, not ever. Something shifted, not in them, in you. You stopped fighting for their approval. You stopped speaking just to be heard. You stopped seeking validation from those who would never give it, because this was never about them. It was about you. And the moment you embraced that truth, the world around you began to shift. Your voice sharpened. Your presence expanded. Your power became undeniable. The victories began stacking, first small, subtle win, tiny shifts in the air, moments where you felt your strength settling into your bone, then bigger. The doubters who once dismissed you, now they watched in silence, the same people who spoke over you. Now they leaned in when you spoke. You didn't need to demand their attention anymore. You commanded it. Then came the crowning moment, the one where the silence wasn't yours. It was theirs, the moment where they had no choice but to listen, no option but to acknowledge that you had become something unstoppable. And standing there, feeling the weight of your own power, you realized, this is what you were meant for. This is who you were always supposed to be. The thunder they once ignored has arrived. It rumbles through the ground beneath them. It shakes the walls they built to contain you. It is no longer distant, no longer a whisper lost in the wind. It is here, and now they hear it. The same voices that once mocked your silence now fall quiet in its presence. The same people who called you weak now watch, breathless, as you take what was always meant to be yours. They never saw it coming, because they mistook patience for passivity. They mistook stillness for submission. They mistook Yaman for someone who would never rise. But you were never weak. You were waiting for the right moment, waiting for the right strength, waiting for the storm inside you to be ready to break free. and now nothing can contain it. Nothing can silence you. Nothing can stop you. To those who are still waiting, to those who have been told they are too quiet, too small, too insignificant to matter, you are not invisible. You are unstoppable. The world will hear your victory. Now roar.